Welcome to the Diagnosing Dyslexia module. At this point in the course, you may have a lot of information swirling around in your head. I know we've covered a lot of ground already in the course, and I shared some broad knowledge about dyslexia. But at this point, I imagine you're ready to do a deep dive into a few points that have the potential to really have long lasting effects. One of those is an actual dyslexia diagnosis. In this module, we'll dive into the who, what, where, and even a little bit of the how of diagnosing dyslexia. As you consider whether or not your child has dyslexia, you might be asking yourself if a diagnosis is even necessary. The short answer is it depends. I know that's not helpful in and of itself, so let's take a closer look at the variables that can affect your decision. Getting a diagnosis allows you as a parent to know exactly what's going on. Both times my husband and I decided to have our children evaluated, the overarching desire was to know what was really going on. We didn't want to work from a hunch. We craved a definitive answer regarding what our children were dealing with so we could help them. A diagnosis gives you, as a parent, the best chance of getting the support your child needs. If you aren't familiar with the terms accommodation, remediation, 504, IEP, any of those things, you'll learn more about those soon. For now, know that students with dyslexia aren't unlike a student with a physical need. As Ben Foss writes, just as we build a ramp for a person in a wheelchair, we should make and accept accommodations for individuals with dyslexia. The sad honest truth is that many people make students suffer through dyslexia and or ADHD without assistance. I often call dyslexia and ADHD invisible opponents that are working against our kids. And as I've already stated, our kids with dyslexia are working so much harder than their peers, only to often show work that reflects such a small percentage of what they know because often they're limited by their deficits in showing what they know. Consider the fact excuse me, that our children are often asked to take in information by reading and show information or show what they know by writing. Both reading and writing are hard for our kids. If, however, kids were asked to take in information by listening, to say audiobooks, and to show what they know by orally discussing it for a grade, you'd see dyslexic students perform much more like their peers. It's important to note it takes tremendous courage for kids that have difficulty reading and writing to show up to school every day and face their fear literally at every turn. The least we can do as parents, teachers, and administrators is support them through this difficulty and make sure that they get the support that they need. You can't get help tailored to their needs if you don't know what those specific needs are. For children with dyslexia, it's not just a specific type of instruction and or intensive tutoring, it's also addressing the fact that they struggle with something many of their peers in their class can do seemingly effortlessly. One of the most critical moments in my experience with my son was when he called himself stupid. As I stated in an earlier module, that's not a word we use in our home. And I knew then that this experience was deeply affecting his self concept and self esteem. When children who struggle get the right instruction, they'll start to understand the rules of language, start to perform better, and their confidence will build. Now you just heard many of the reasons why I believe a diagnosis can be extremely helpful, but there are probably just as many parents who don't or didn't feel a need to get a diagnosis. For example, many parents who homeschool may opt to skip getting an evaluation because they usually provide a lot of the academic support their child needs and in a way that their child needs it. Additionally, students with dyslexia, even if they don't have a diagnosis, can usually get private tutoring or with through some of the tutoring programs that I mentioned in Module 2. So a diagnosis isn't required in order to start remediating or any kind of deficits that you may see in your child. So let's say you suspect dyslexia and are open to getting a diagnosis. What now? The next step is to get your child evaluated. But who can diagnose dyslexia? I want to share something that I don't think many people have ever considered outside of those parents who have children with dyslexia. Here are some of the supportive people and roles that surround a child. This is just an example. I'm sure I've left some out in this example, but it's safe to say most children will run into adults in these roles fairly regularly. Now I want you to guess How many of these can diagnose dyslexia? If you guessed zero, you'd be correct. The fact that no one in this chart can diagnose dyslexia may be shocking to you if you're new to the world of having or working with struggling readers or dyslexic kiddos. But the fact of the matter is, your pediatrician 9 times out of 10 can't diagnose dyslexia. I think this is a common misconception among school personnel or parents because of the prevalence of pediatricians who will diagnose disorders like ADHD. The fact of the matter is, often pediatricians will refer you to the school if the issue you're seeing is causing an academic problem, which by the time parents have suspected an issue is usually already creating academic concerns. Then you'll go to the school and they may often recommend you talk to your child's doctor. But the fact of the matter is there are very few, if any, adults in most children's lives that can diagnose dyslexia. Continuing with our example, you'll notice I've added a spot for a neuropsychologist. What does a neuropsychologist do? They focus on neurobehavioral disorders, cognitive processes, and brain disorders. Notice on the hierarchy, there isn't a line linking the neuropsychologist to the child. That's because most children will never see one. And what's more frustrating is that if a child is able to see a neuropsychologist, most evaluations are extremely costly and aren't covered by insurance. I've added a counselor under health and wellness, and I've also added a school psychologist under education. There may be a counselor or school psychologist that could give you, as a parent, more information about what is occurring with your child. For example, if the counselor you happen to see for whatever issue brought you to the counselor also happens to be qualified to diagnose dyslexia. The fact of the matter is, it's pretty rare for a child to encounter someone organically in their life who will be able to diagnose them. I think often someone thinks dyslexia will be caught by someone in the child's life, including us as parents. I wrongly assumed teachers in my children's lives would know why my child was struggling academically, but that just wasn't the case. I had to research the symptoms I was seeing myself and talk to other parents as well. I'm here to tell you the only people in a child's life that usually catch the signs of dyslexia and do the research it takes to understand what is happening with the child are the parents. This is the exact reason why this course has been my passion for almost a year. Because unless someone has a regularly standing appointment with a neuropsychologist, similar to, like an annual checkup with a pediatrician, dyslexia won't be spotted as early as it should be, if at all. Needless to say, there is a major hole in how warning signs for dyslexia get spotted and how dyslexia is actually diagnosed. This is why it's so important for parents to know the signs of dyslexia as early as possible. One more point before I move on. I do want to point out that what this chart also shows, and that's the individuals who are providing support in our child's lives. A good teacher is worth their weight in gold. They see hundreds of kids throughout their professional life, and they can offer parents an amazing window into benchmarks for the age group your child is in. If they seem concerned, in my experience, it's best to listen. As I mentioned, they may not understand why they are seeing what they are seeing, but they can offer you insights into what they are seeing. And that can help you try to discover what's going on. If they aren't concerned, but in your gut you know something is wrong, maybe this is your opportunity to educate them so other students can benefit from them learning about dyslexia. At the end of the day, working with teachers, in my experience, has proven to be my best strategy versus assuming they don't have your child's best interest in mind. I haven't had a teacher yet that truly understood dyslexia, but all have invested in my children so far to one degree or another. I want to make a quick point before we get too deep into what an evaluation involves. An evaluation and a diagnosis are not the same things and are not interchangeable. To get a dyslexia diagnosis, an individual must undergo an evaluation, but not all evaluations result in a dyslexia diagnosis. The reason I wanted to make sure to make this distinction between the two is because one, there's a whole lot of jargon that will be thrown around, and I want you to know these are different things. And two, I want you to realize that an evaluation may not always equal a dyslexia diagnosis. As we journey through this lesson, if you start to become discouraged as you learn how children are diagnosed and how many holes there are in the system, I want to make sure you are aware that for every shortcoming, there are individuals within the science of reading that want to advocate and help kids with dyslexia. I liked this definition from the USA News regarding evaluations for dyslexia. There's no single test that confirms a diagnosis of dyslexia. Rather, a series of reading tests, along with observations from parents and teachers, are considered. The main takeaway here is that there is a battery, meaning a group of tests that are done to determine if someone is dyslexic or not. Because remember, individuals with dyslexia have deficits in their phonological processing center. Here I've included the phonological awareness umbrella again so you can see just how many things can be affected and why it's important to do many different tests. The professional conducting the test needs to rule out possible diagnoses in the process of testing for dyslexia. It's not like doctors would go into a test with a child saying, "Okay, we're looking for dyslexia, so that's all we're going to consider." They are also considering the brain and the challenges that the child is presenting with, and trying to chart the best way forward to make sure they get a complete picture of what is occurring for the child and why. One of the tests that's included is an intelligence test, because remember, dyslexia, in its most simplest terms, as a problem with reading in a student who has the intelligence to be a much better reader. The IQ test helps to provide insight on whether the student can do the work but is struggling for some other reason, like dyslexia. I've alluded to this, but I want to go into more detail about the two roads that are the most common to get an evaluation. One path involves a parent writing their child's school and requesting an evaluation. Another path involves a parent reaching out to a private neuropsychologist or psychologist to request an evaluation. Although states have differences in who, what, and when of evaluations for students, and I can't speak to all of those because it's wide ranging, I will say by and large on your screen are the key takeaways as we compare and contrast each one. In a school setting, and here I'm not talking about a homeschooled child or a student who attends a charter school or even a private school, although I suspect a private school may look a little similar to this. I'm talking about a public education setting. In this type of school setting, a parent must reach out to the school and formally request a diagnosis. Every school is different. You'll want to figure out to whom your correspondence should be addressed. Once you have requested a diagnosis, a sort of stopwatch starts. There are extensive laws in place to help families and children with special needs get what they need in an appropriate time and manner. It may not always be as fast as some would prefer, but at least there are requirements. Again, this will differ with individual states. How much does this process cost? Nothing. As a parent, this process should cost you as a parent, this process should cost you nothing monetarily. The evaluation, if your request is approved, should be free of charge. I've experienced both a school evaluation and private evaluation with my own children. And one of the most disappointing experiences I had with our specific school in our specific state was that they informed me during the review process. So that's after this happens after the evaluation already took place and they tested our child for a number of hours, that they couldn't diagnose dyslexia, even though he showed all the signs. And they also wouldn't even say the name dyslexia. Now, this seems to be a specific problem with my school district because there was a white paper issued in our state saying institutions of education can and should use the term dyslexia when it applies. And in this particular case, it did apply. He has dyslexia. My school, however, despite my son having dyslexia, wouldn't say it. So while an evaluation in a school setting can be quite valuable in getting resources and accommodations for your child, if a diagnosis is what you want, it may not be the best option. Again, check with your individual state and the school district. When does an evaluation happen in a school setting? Well, first, a child getting an evaluation largely is dependent on a parent requesting it and giving consent. The timeline will then depend on your state's specific timeline set forth by your uh, uh, Department of Education. The other road many parents go down is to get a private evaluation. This is typically done with a neuropsychologist or educational psychologist. The cost can be between $1,000 to $5,000, depending on where you live and who you use and what your insurance will cover if it covers anything. I could write an entire presentation about the inequities around dyslexia, but I'll save that for another day. For now, just know a private evaluation is a very big investment. So, what is the benefit of going through a private evaluation versus a school evaluation? In our specific case, the private evaluation can actually result in diagnosing the student. As we discussed in earlier modules, dyslexia doesn't go away. So once they have a diagnosis, this can help your child for a very long time throughout their educational and professional experience. What does the timeline look like for a private evaluation? In our experience, there was a very lengthy wait list. I think it's worth mentioning that there are other ways to get your child evaluated, and they may be more cost friendly than a private evaluation, but more, for lack of a better word, helpful than a school evaluation. If you're interested in finding a different path, I suggest calling your local International Dyslexia Association to see if they know of cost friendly ways to get your child evaluated. Also, a really great source in many different states is the Children's Dyslexia Center. They do not do formal evaluations, but they might be able to steer you in the right direction of getting an evaluation. By now, you've heard me mention understood.org. I think in the last module, I talked a little bit about them. It's an amazing resource. The process for requesting a private evaluation is a little more cut and dry because you are paying for it and you essentially just need to call up a knowledgeable, well respected, well known psychologist or neuropsychologist to get an evaluation, or call your nearby children's hospital. I'd prefer to spend a little more time talking about how to request an evaluation at your child's school. So I'm turning to understood.org to share these tips. So, number one, find out where to send your request. Number two, write a formal letter. This can be in the form of an email. It's actually easier to track it that way. So, that's what I did in my experience, both times. Be specific about why you're requesting the evaluation, and we'll cover on the next slide. I'll show you a letter example that you can use. Um, Number four, consent to your child being evaluated. In our case, even though I wrote in the letter that I consented, we still had to then, they followed up with us and we had to sign some paperwork. Number five, make sure that the letter arrives. So if it's an email, you can track that when you sent it, and then you can also follow up if you don't hear back. And then number six, obviously, follow up. A word to the wise, you're going to want to keep notes throughout this entire process. You will want to keep most, if not all, correspondence in email or through written communication. This can be a lengthy process and there can be a lot of jargon that gets said. It serves you to keep all correspondence in a written manner so you don't have to try to remember what someone said a few months ago. This helps you stay organized and it provides you with a timeline based on when you sent the request. By law, as I mentioned earlier, schools need to act within a certain timeline, and we've already said time is of the essence in terms of your child getting support. So you really don't want to lose any time in the process. If you aren't familiar with your particular state's timeline, you may want to do a quick search of, and put these in quotes, IEP evaluation timeline for, and then insert your state's name at the end of that phrase. This will tell you how quickly your school is required to get back to you. Here's an example, a sample letter you can write to request an evaluation. And you can see I put, you'll want some specifics about your child, their name, their grade, their school name, even though it's probably going directly to the principal of that school, but it's still a good idea, to add that. Other important specifics to add is what you are seeing or hearing about regarding school and their performance. Additionally, if it's applicable, maybe issues at home, but with academic topics such as homework or spelling tests or something else. Then you'll also want to explain what you've been doing to try to help your child. Many times this can be as helpful for the school to know as it is for you to showcase all the hard work you've been doing to help your child. Once you send the request for an evaluation, keep note of the date because again, that's important in terms of the timeline that will follow. And then let's talk about the timeline. I've already alluded to this, but let's talk about like a typical timeline and what happens throughout the process. First, you request an evaluation. The school will get back in touch with you to set up a meeting. You will then have to provide consent if you didn't previously in your letter. You would think requesting an evaluation would be enough, but most often it isn't. You have to sign things for the school. From there, the school will schedule an evaluation, and you, as a parent, will be asked to fill out some information as well. Additionally, your child's teacher will be asked to provide some information and share observations they've made concerning your child, or yeah, your child in the classroom. After that process ends, the school representative will need to compile all of that information, and then they will reach out to you to review the information, and the team then makes a determination of if the child meets the eligibility criteria. If they meet the eligibility criteria, then they will start receiving services. These services can include remediation to help bring the child up to grade level, and accommodations to help support the child as they're learning. And these can and should be as individual as the child's needs are. If your school makes a determination that this student doesn't qualify for services, but you know your child is drowning and needs help, another way to put it is you know something is going on and you don't feel this process got to the core of the issue, you can always request an IEE, which stands for Independent Educational Evaluation. An IEE is an evaluation that is conducted by a qualified person who is not employed by the school district that serves the student. You can request this at the public expense from the school district. Important to note before we end, a private evaluation would look similar to this experience, except that after the evaluation is conducted, and if your child is found to have dyslexia, you then will need to notify the school. And in my experience, we still had to go through the formal request for evaluation process. And so the timeline above looks very similar. Also, before we end this session, I wanted to invite you to check out the next module entitled You Received a Dyslexia Diagnosis, Now What? Even if you haven't received a diagnosis. For example, let's say you went through the school evaluation process and they didn't actually diagnose you, but they mentioned a few keywords that hint at dyslexia. So, issues with phonemes, fluency, laborious reading, or maybe even concerns around comprehension when your child is reading, etc. This is still a module you will want to go through. Additionally, if you are a parent who believes in your gut something is wrong, but the school didn't diagnose or even find any cause for concern, this will still be a good module for you to go through. Also, if you are still going through the evaluation process or haven't even started, go ahead and move forward with the course, because the information we cover there is important and can still apply even as you go through the evaluation process. So that's it for today. We'll see you over in You Received a Dyslexia Diagnosis. Now what?